Welcome to the Watchdog on MintPress. This is Lowkey. As you know, weekly we are going against the grain, covering stories which are often sidelined by the mainstream media. For that reason, we hope that you can support us on Patreon if you can, and also share, like, subscribe, and comment on this video here. We are up against major algorithmic engineering and shadow banning, so it would be great if in an organic way this video can be spread as widely and as far as possible. This week we will be discussing what is the difference and the distinction between Emma Watson and J.K. Rowling. As you will all know, the Harry Potter star Emma Watson recently posted a picture full of Palestinian flags and placards supporting Palestinian liberation with the quote, "Solidarity is a verb" in the middle of it, taken, of course, from the scholar Sarah Ahmed, to which the response was Danny Danon, the former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, denouncing her as an anti-Semite. We also saw other voices join the chorus. Now we have seen around 50 Hollywood stars, including Susan Sarandon and people closer to home like Ken Loach, coming out in support of Emma Watson, sticking their nose up at the powerful pro-Israel lobby, not only within Hollywood and entertainment, but within the media. Now, if we contrast and compare that to the response to what has happened with J.K. Rowling, the writer of Harry Potter, an ultimate beneficiary of all of its success. Jon Stewart, the popular American comedian, came out recently and accused, really, and it seems to have been the case in what he said, that he was accusing J.K. Rowling of being an anti-Semite, and criticized the images of bankers in Harry Potter as anti-Semitic tropes. Now, the response to that was widespread defense from many of the very same organizations in this country who militated relentlessly against Jeremy Corbyn, and in fact, quite ironically, picked on Corbyn's Facebook comment on a mural that was painted by someone and was removed, supposedly for being an anti-Semitic trope. Of course, the majority of the bankers depicted in that mural were not actually Jewish. And the point is that when juxtaposing that image of that mural to the images within J.K. Rowling's films, one could argue that the film's depiction of bankers was far closer to anti-Semitism than that mural was. But yet, why the hypocrisy? The very same organizations like Community Security Trust, Dave Rich, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, and others went over and above to smear Jeremy Corbyn. And in the case of Emma Watson, it was an Israeli government official that actually targeted her. But the support that J.K. Rowling got was comprehensive and widespread across these pro-Israel groups in Britain. Now, here today to talk about this hypocrisy and to dig in a little bit into what may lie behind it is MintPress's senior staff writer, Alan MacLeod. As we know, after completing his PhD in 2017, he has published 2 books, Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting, and Propaganda in the Information Age, Still Manufacturing Consent. Alan has written articles everywhere, not only regularly on MintPress, you know, he's written for Salon, The Grey Zone, Jacobin Magazine, and even The Guardian. Today, he's here minus his inspirational fringe, but still full of useful information. Thank you for joining us, Alan.
What's going on? How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you today?
Very good, thanks.
So, I guess we should get in straight away. You've recently published an article looking at some of this info around J.K. Rowling, essentially looking at her political trajectory in quite a critical and investigative way. What did you find?
Well, I think if we're going to look at the question of why was Emma Watson treated in one way and why was Rowling treated in a very different way, I think it really comes down to their personal politics. Watson's politics tends to be quite progressive, quite liberal, whereas Rowling started off as relatively left wing, but in recent years she's been getting much more centrist, much more right wing. She's supported the right wing of the Labour Party against Jeremy Corbyn. She was one of the key public figures accusing him of being anti-Semitic and his followers of being, very similar to the far right. In 2015, she famously signed a letter that was denouncing the BDS movement and boycotts of Israel in general. She said they were divisive and discriminatory. And backing up what she said when she justified her signature on that, she said that, why do we not, for instance, boycott North Korea or Zimbabwe? Of course, leaving off the obvious fact that North Korea is not only boycotted, but under huge sanctions, which are crippling the country. So in fact, those countries are in fact in a de facto boycott anyway. When was the last time you saw North Korean artists performing in London or DC or New York? So yeah, she has been a tireless defender of Israel, and I think that really illustrates why the sympathy for her has come from pro-Israel groups. An Israeli marketing firm actually described her as the fourth most important Zionist influencer in the world. She was the highest non-Jew on there, the highest Gentile, above people like Natalie Portman, above Mossad, above all sorts of figures. And I think really a lot of her connections to Israeli government policy come from her agent, Neil Blair. Now, Blair is not only her agent, he used to be very high up in Warner Brothers. He runs Pottermore, which is her digital and e-commerce platform. He is also the chairman of her charity, Lumos. He also runs Bronte Films, which is a production company which brings many of her novels to the small screen, for instance, the BBC production of The Casual Vacancy. So I think it's reasonable to say that Blair almost, in a sense, runs her life. Now, Neil Blair is very active in the Abraham Initiatives. He is an ambassador for that group. The Abraham Initiatives is a group that's set up supposedly to promote dialogue and peace and try to promote greater understanding and greater links between Israeli artists and the Western world. Now, it talks a good game about being all about peace through dialogue, but of course, that fundamentally breaks the principle of BDS, which says that we cannot have any sort of dialogue. We have to really come together to stop one party doing something to another party. Abraham Initiatives is, of course, directly financed by the Israeli state, the Israeli government. It's also financed by the EU and by USAID, which a lot of MintPress readers and viewers will probably know is something of a front for the CIA. It's also funded by the US State Department through the Middle Eastern Partnership Initiative, which was made famous, or should I say infamous, by WikiLeaks when they published some cables that showed that MEPI was actually the way in which the US government was funding jihadists in Syria in the Syrian civil war. I think everybody should remember that infamous email that Jake Stewart sent to Hillary Clinton while he was national security advisor and she was Secretary of State. It said, in Syria, and I quote, Al-Qaeda is on our side. Blair and Rowling also supported Bana al-Abed, who was a girl, a Syrian blogger and Twitter personality who lived in rebel-controlled Aleppo. and was constantly tweeting things about, it's better to start World War III than let us suffer under the Russian bombs, constantly talking about how Western forces had to put boots on the ground in Syria to save people like her. Blair and Rowling, well, Blair specifically was also important in the backlash against the boycott of the Sydney Festival, which has been going on quite recently. Around 40% of the acts at Sydney and one board member have actually pulled out of the festival altogether because the festival accepted funding from the Israeli government. And they felt that this was really a way of Israel trying to arts wash its negative image around the world. Blair jumped into action. He was one of the signers of an important note, a memo that went around talking about how the organizers of the boycott at the Sydney Festival fundamentally mischaracterize and lie about Israel and its relationship with Palestine. And it's really a who's who of people in the arts industry on there. There are executives from, Warner and Virgin Records. There's all sorts of, vice presidents on there. Jacqueline Saturn, the president of Virgin Music. David Levy, the former president of Turner Warner Media. This grouping of people is really supposedly, talking about how this is the wrong way to go about things. But ultimately, I think this is a real threat to artistic types saying that you should not engage in BDS, otherwise there will be consequences for your career. And so ultimately, when we're talking about Watson versus Rowling, Rowling has consistently been a friend of the Israeli government, whereas Watson has generally stood up a little bit more for the common person. And I think that's specifically what this is all about. All too often, the discussion about anti-Semitism, especially in the UK, really comes down to support for the government of Israel rather than anything racist towards Jews and the people of Israel.
Well, also, I think the thing that needs to be emphasized about the Neil Blair connection to J.K. Rowling is, as you said, he essentially manages her life. He's her agent. He was involved in the production of Harry Potter. He heads her charity. He heads her business. On top of that, Neil Blair and the infrastructure that he's plugged into vis-a-vis what the Israeli state is trying, the way in which the Israeli state projects its agency into Britain, is when you look at this organization, the Abraham Initiatives, on its own trustees report, it says that it advances synergy between Israeli bodies and respective agencies and institutions in the UK. As you have said, it is funded not only by the Israeli Ministry of Education, but also the Israeli Ministry of Justice. So the extent to which it is an arm of the Israeli government seems quite clear. It was, of course, founded by Alan B. Slivka, who was awarded a prize by the Israeli Knesset in 2000 for this organization, for his work with the Abraham Initiatives. Today, the Alan B. Slivka Foundation funds not only the Abraham Initiatives, but also the Friends of the IDF and the Jerusalem Foundation, which builds settlements in Sheikh Jarrah. It also funds the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which recently ranked the BBC as the third most anti-Semitic institution in the world. We also have to remember that the chairman of the Abraham Initiatives is Alex Brummer, who not only working for the Daily Mail, he is also the vice president of the Board of Deputies, which according to its 2020 trustees report has a close working relationship with the Israeli embassy in the UK and strengthened links with the IDF. We also have to remember that the co-executive director of the Abraham Initiatives is also a former employee of the Israeli Ministry of Immigration and also an employee formerly of the Jerusalem Foundation, which, as I said, builds settlements in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. Now, when we think about the organizations that Neil Blair rub shoulders with, who have come out to protect J.K. Rowling, we also have to deconstruct their relationship with the state of Israel. The campaign against anti-Semitism was set up in 2014, linked its establishment to the increase in anti-Semitism, which supposedly came in tandem with the Israeli campaign of violence in Gaza, which killed over 2,000 people. Now, the chief executive and founder of the campaign against anti-Semitism is Gideon Falter. Well, Gideon Falter is also simultaneous to that a vice chairman of the Jewish National Fund. And on Companies House, he's listed as a director of the Jewish National Fund in the UK. The JNF builds settlements, illegal settlements in the West Bank. Now, the first director of communications for the campaign against anti-Semitism is, of course, Jonathan Sakadotti. Now, Jonathan Sakadotti went on to work for GB News and also was a director at the same time of the Zionist Federation. Now, let's not forget that Jonathan Sakadotti now works for the Simon Wiesenthal Center, the same organization which called the BBC the world's third most anti-Semitic institution. Now, Jonathan Sakadotti, in 2014, during Israel's killing spree in Gaza, appeared on the BBC 4 separate times in 2 days. So what we have is links to the campaign against anti-Semitism and people who formerly were employed by it, who now are comfortable defining the BBC as anti-Semitic, but would never describe J.K. Rowling's depictions of bankers as anti-Semitic. You also have Joseph Cohen involved intimately with the campaign against anti-Semitism, and he, of course, founded the Israel advocacy movement. So clearly the campaign against anti-Semitism is linked very closely to the state of Israel. When we look at the community, well, you could say it is at least pro-Israel. In terms of the Community Security Trust, Dave Rich, you know, that constant targeter of Jeremy Corbyn, and many others, mainly pro-Palestinians, it seems, have been targeted for his ire when it comes to the issue of anti-Semitism of the Community Security Trust. Now, let's remember, you know, he came out when this J.K. Rowling story came out and said sometimes a goblin is just a goblin. Now, this organization, Community Security Trust, was set up by Gerald Ronson, the uncle of the famous musician Mark Ronson. Gerald Ronson is a convicted fraudster and was sentenced to 6 months in prison for his part in the Guinness share scandal. Now, while he was in jail, he received a telephone call from the Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Shamir, and later, when he was on day release, actually received a personal visit from Benjamin Netanyahu. And in 2007, when Benjamin Netanyahu was running for office, it was revealed that one of his donors was Gerald Ronson. Now, why is Gerald Ronson important? Well, he is the founder of the Community Security Trust. And 2 other founding trustees of the Community Trust were also, along with Ronson, central to, quote unquote, one of Israel's most important national institutions. That is the United Jewish Israel Appeal, which is the arm of the Israel fundraising infrastructure within this country. Now, Community Security Trust now receives £14 million of British taxpayers' funding every single year. But let's not forget that initially, when Michael Gove was Education Secretary and simultaneously on the board of advisors for the Community Security Trust, he gave them £2 million of public money despite that connection and that relationship. That is simple, straightforward corruption. Now, Anthony Learman of the well-known Institute for Jewish Policy Research, who has had long-time dealings with the Community Security Trust, asserted that this organization, which gives the Home Office blacklists of anti-Zionist Jews and defines them as extremists to the Home Office, this organization's employees and volunteers are actually trained, according to Anthony Learman, by Israel's external intelligence agency. So these organizations who are coming to the defense of J.K. Rowling and directly have mentioned her support for the community over the last few years mean her support in the campaign against Corbyn, which was vigorous, but they also mean this support for Israeli apartheid in Palestine. As you mentioned, in 2015, she signed the Cultures for Coexistence letter, which Neil Blair was involved in, and that organization seems to have just disappeared into the ether. But another organization, which you mentioned, which I would like us to go into when thinking about the entertainment sector, is, of course, Creative Community for Peace, which published this letter signed by Neil Blair and many other powerful figures within the music and entertainment industry. Less relevant musicians, the only one they could persuade to sign it was Gene Simmons from Kiss. But the Creative Community for Peace, this anti-BDS organization, could you tell us a bit about that, please, Alan?
Yeah, sure. It does seem that these organizations do pop up at times when international condemnation of Israel starts to rise. This group, again, is relatively new. It was started about 10 years ago. Again, its stated goal is basically to oppose BDS and call for more sorts of dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians. But of course, you could see that, a cynic anyway, could see that as being just, putting soporific language out there about hope and change, while nothing ever actually, gets done. And so it sort of traps Palestinians and people in the more sort of generally left-wing sphere into just like these constant little, talk shops, which never actually get anything done. Creative Community for Peace has a lot of links with Stand With Us, which is a right-wing pro-Israel advocacy movement, which is more or less open about its connections to the Israeli government. The former Israeli deputy foreign minister and ambassador to the US said that, it's true, we are using Stand With Us for leverage. That's a direct quote from him. The head or the founder of Creative Community for Peace is David Resner. His wife, Esther, co-founded Stand With Us. And of course, for a couple of years, they were actually intertwined financially as well. So if you wanted to donate to Creative Community for Peace, you had to do it through Stand With Us. And as you said, they've put out this letter opposing the actions at the Sydney Festival. You actually just did a really good podcast interviewing some of the organizers of that movement, which everybody should check out, and also subscribe to the Watchdog as well. They basically said that, the organizers intentionally misrepresent the truth about Israel, and that they were politicizing art in a way that was really not helpful. But of course, art can always be fundamentally political. This isn't a new thing. This has been going on for centuries. So of course, this is really about trying to control what sort of message gets conveyed. They do not want this worldwide movement to keep growing, because ultimately that will threaten the expansionist interests of the Israeli government.
Yes, and Creative Community for Peace is essentially the music and arts side of the Israel lobby. Dave Renzer, who started it, was the CEO of Universal Publishing and the husband of the founder of Stand With Us. And as you said, Israel Emergency Alliance was the overarching structure which underneath Stand With Us and Creative Community for Peace were part of. Literally on the tax filings, they were the same organization. Now, Creative Community for Peace, as you said, it works on lobbying musicians to violate BDS and go and perform in the apartheid Israeli state. And I think the wonderful thing that has been revealed by this entire situation in Sydney is that that contradiction and that sort of stratification of the music industry clearly shows where each side stands when it comes to Israeli apartheid. When you look at the people that signed the letter that the Sydney Festival boycott organizers put out, these are artists. These are the people that create the work which is then sold. When you look at the people that sign the Creative Community for Peace, these are almost like the permanent government of the music industry. These are the people who have benefited from it for decades and continue to benefit from it. They are in the highest echelons of these companies, and they're rabidly anti-BDS. And Creative Community for Peace is the vehicle through which that agency expresses itself within entertainment. And so then the question would be for those brave and courageous artists who have stood up to that pressure, and even a board member has resigned from the Sydney Festival, the question will be, what kind of state will their careers be in? If you want to know why an artist like me can amass over 40 million YouTube views, sell tens of thousands of albums, tour the world, and make a living off of music, but yet never be approached by a major label, then really you should look no further than that Creative Community for Peace letter about this core issue of Palestine and BDS. What we failed to realize in the Corbyn years is that Palestine is the litmus test for both sides of this equation. It's a litmus test for a very powerful lobby group with a serious grip on aspects and extreme levels of integration with the British establishment, but it also should be the litmus test for us. Those that partook in the witch hunt and backed it at different levels should be held accountable for what they did. It led to thousands of people, in many cases, livelihoods harmed, but at very, very least being cancelled out of political subjectivity, being told that they had no right to be politically active or belong essentially to a political party merely because of their position on Israeli apartheid. A major operation has been carried out in this country, and we were all targets of it. To move on to the next topic in the podcast, Alan, we are going to look at something which many people view as an almost friendly uncle growing up, a friendly member of the family. It raises them, it teaches them about the world. They get their ideas from it. You know, half of our conversation today has been about human beings who generally have got very wealthy off of merely working as part of this industry. We are talking about Hollywood and its connection to the US security state. And you may just break some people's hearts today when they hear how some of their favorite films seem to have had the involvement literally in production of the US security state. So it now seems to be widely well known, especially amongst MintPress audiences, but possibly not the rest of the world, that at least 800 films that have been produced in Hollywood and over 1,000 television shows that have come out of Hollywood have actually had the involvement of the Department of Defense in the United States in their production. But what we're going to look at firstly when talking about this Hollywood side of things is Sasha Baron Cohen. Now, tell me about Bruno, for example. What was the involvement of the US security state in the production of Sasha Baron Cohen's wildly successful film, Bruno?
Yeah, Bruno is one of the 814 movies on the list that we have from Freedom of Information documents that we've been able to get. It's one of the movies that the Department of Defense was involved with. If you don't know, Bruno is a 2009 mockumentary about a flamboyantly gay Austrian TV reporter who goes around the world. And the point is to try to expose homophobia and bigoted attitudes. The Department of Defense was involved in Bruno. There's a long scene where Bruno goes to a US military base to learn to be more heterosexual. What could be more heterosexual, of course, than spending all your time with other men, sleeping in the same room with them, etc. The entire part of it, though, doesn't really mock the military, and in fact feels quite staged. There's a lot of drill instructors who seem to be setting him up for clever one-liners. So yeah, it does feel a bit strained. Now, the production company's version of events is that they lied to the military to gain access to the base, and then they filmed there. And the reason that nobody clicked that one of the most famous comedians in the world, who was performing a character which had already been public for more than a decade by then, the reason that they didn't realize that was going on was that the hundreds of infantrymen or, low-down privates who recognized him were not allowed to speak to their officers because of this very strong, strict discipline they had. And so that's why they were none the wiser. But after a few hours, they sensed that the military were starting to catch on that something was going wrong. So they quickly legged in their Jeep and then sped out the door. And, even as the military were telling them to come back and that the gate was closing down on them, they managed to just squeeze under it and escape. Now, that sounds really incredible, like it's from, Indiana Jones or whatever. But as a lot of people have pointed out, if you do shoot on a military base, you do need every single frame to be signed off by the Department of Defense. So it does seem rather odd that if this was the case, the DoD just simply said, yeah, this is all fine. Bruno also had involvement with the CIA as well. There's a scene where Sasha Baron Cohen wanted to go to Palestine and interview real terrorists, as he said, from Hamas or Hezbollah. And so he casually stated in an interview with David Letterman that he got a CIA contact to arrange some interviews with terrorists. Now, I actually found out who that CIA contact was. He's actually now a whistleblower, and spoke to him, and the contact said that this was a crazy idea and you shouldn't do it, etc. But it does actually end up in the film. Of course, who he was interviewing perhaps wasn't quite the terrorist that we were made out, that audiences were, made out to be talking to. In fact, he was a Christian NGO worker who was told that he was going to be interviewed about his peace activism, and he actually sued the production company for $100 million. And in 2012, he settled out of court with them. Interestingly, though, one of the most crazy and shocking moments that Baron Cohen has ever managed to capture on film, which really showed a lot of homophobia, has never made the light of day. And that was actually when he went to Israeli Jerusalem and, paraded about in his normal flamboyant clothes. He was actually attacked by a group of homophobic Israelis who beat him almost to death and stoned him like it was something going on in 3000 BC. And the CIA contact told me that even a rabbi joined in and was spitting on Baron Cohen. And that was the only time in his professional career where he actually broke character and started screaming, I'm not a homosexual, I'm actually an Israeli Jew, I'm an actor, I'm famous. But that didn't really seem to get the crowds to stop. And he actually had to run away and hide in a bathroom in a nearby store. It's interesting that that's never seen the light of day, because that's probably the most remarkable scene that he could have had, which was all on camera, which really exposes people's latent bigotry. But of course, perhaps that was telling the wrong sort of message to the one he really wanted to give.
On this question of Sasha Baron Cohen and Israel, tell us about the series The Spy, where he plays the role of Eli Cohen.
Sure, yeah. So The Spy was a TV miniseries that Baron Cohen produced and starred in. And it lionizes Eli Cohen, who is a real-life Mossad agent in the 1960s. Cohen went undercover in Syria, deep undercover, and penetrated the highest echelons of society there and sent back crucial information to Israel, which the Israeli state says was key in it winning the 1967 war against its neighbors. And of course, to this day, Israel still occupies Syria and Palestine illegally, the land it conquered in that war. The Spy was hailed in Israel, and in fact, even the Washington Post said that it was part of a broader Mossad recruitment drive. A lot of critics said that it was a bit, too on the nose, and even, normie critics said that this is kind of propagandistic, and the message was that Cohen is good and Syrians are bad. The entire thing was directed by a former IDF paratrooper who also made the Homeland series, which is more or less written by US national security state agents. And so ultimately, this was something which was an absolute celebration of the Israeli national security state. And it was seen as such at the time as well.
Tell me a bit about Sasha Baron Cohen's work with the Anti-Defamation League. This is, of course, an organization that in FBI internal memos in 1969, they pondered whether it violated the Registration of Foreign Agents Act. And I am quoting verbatim from the FBI memo here. They said, "It is incredible to assume that this organization is not furnished by an official from the Israeli state." Now, what is Sasha Baron Cohen's dealings with the ADL?
Well, he's been a big supporter of that organization, actually. They, in fact, gave him an award in 2019 for his work combating anti-Semitism. And the ADL does do work, highlighting anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry. But it's also historically really, served as something as an unofficial security force or intelligence force. It, of course, has spied on a wide swath of leftist groups in the United States, especially Jewish leftist groups. It, penetrated all sorts of organizations. It even spied on people like Desmond Tutu, and it was passing information on in the 1980s to the apartheid government in South Africa as well. Baron Cohen doesn't make his politics completely blatant, but sometimes his personal politics do sort of seep into his work. And of course, at the time of the Israeli attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque in May, there was, a lot of heightened criticism of Israel. Baron Cohen said nothing about the slaughter of hundreds of people and the displacement of tens of thousands more in Gaza. But he did come together with the ADL and share their concerns about a surge of anti-Semitism on the streets and on social media. And so at the height of these Israeli crimes, he was basically running interference for them. And he was demanding that Facebook and other big social media giants take steps to censor anti-Semitism on their platforms. Now, of course, Facebook and other groups, they are awash with all sorts of racism. That's completely true. But it also belies the fact that Facebook has, for a very long time, worked with the Israeli government. In fact, somebody who was formerly very high up in the Ministry of Justice in Israel, who essentially was overseeing things like forcing Palestinians out of their homes illegally, is now on the board of Facebook. And the Israeli government has, for a long time, bragged that it's worked with Facebook and that Facebook accepts more than 95% of its requests to censor Palestinian voices from their platform. And of course, even people who work for MintPress were having their social media accounts blocked or suspended at the time of the Al-Aqsa Mosque attack. And so it really seems to be that actually these groups do work somewhat in coordination with the Israeli government, even if Baron Cohen says otherwise.
Well, I mean, it's actually even worse than this former employee from the Ministry of Justice being on the board. She's on the Facebook oversight team alongside Alan Rusbridger, formerly of The Guardian, who was taken down to the basement by people from GCHQ and forced to destroy the files, the Snowden files, in a very symbolic sort of gesture. Also, one important point regarding Sasha Baron Cohen's initial award that he was given by the ADL and his speech targeting Facebook, saying that it needs to regulate anti-Semites, you have to understand that at that time, the ADL had just set up their Silicon Valley unit, which was funded by Pierre Omidyar, of course, of PayPal fame. The ADL is also now working with PayPal to work out how extremists are funded, quote unquote. But this Silicon Valley unit was then the reason for the ADL being accepted by YouTube as a trusted flagger, meaning that, for instance, my video Terrorist, which amassed 5.4 million views, is now today barely viewable on YouTube. In fact, you are asked to send a picture of your passport or give evidence of your credit card to verify your identity, which then takes a few days in order for you to watch the video. Now, this coincided with the ADL being given that trusted flagger status on YouTube. There could be a relationship, there may not. But was Sasha Baron Cohen's intervention at this ADL award ceremony an attempt to pressure Facebook even further to perhaps grant the ADL a similar kind of trusted flagger status that they have at YouTube, thanks to Google? Now, I wonder, the ADL, of course, is a rabidly anti-BDS organization and defines it as anti-Semitic. What is Sasha Baron Cohen's position that you've been able to identify on BDS?
Well, I think it's probably unsurprising that he is also against BDS. He hasn't often, he doesn't come out and say it directly too often. He has campaigned against it before. There's an article in my piece talking about how Baron Cohen has slammed other festivals for pulling out of contracts with the Israeli government and promoting BDS. He has also said a couple of things about it. For instance, in character, as one of his characters, he said, "Boycotting, yeah, fantastic. As long as they're Jews, it's all right. I'm not racist, but keep the Jews out." So, of course, he's saying there that, BDS is really secretly some sort of far-right skinhead movement, which is dedicated to attacking Jewish people rather than opposing certain policies of the Israeli government in a coordinated effort to try to get them to change those policies. So ultimately, I think Baron Cohen has taken a very sort of simplistic approach towards BDS and saying that, anything that they do is wrong. And so ultimately, there is this sense that a lot of people who are involved in these organizations just see criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic inherently. And so ultimately, there's really nothing you can do about that. That's really an extremist position which can't be negotiated.
Yeah. Now, I'm just going to drop for you some titles from Hollywood, and it would be great for you to expand on the way in which those titles have had involvement in production of the US security state. So the first title, very popular film, tell me about Iron Man.
Sure. So the Department of Defense was certainly involved in Iron Man. The Freedom of Information request documents show that the DoD provided Iron Man's production company with an Air Force base in California to use. Edwards Air Force Base, it's quite close to Los Angeles. It's very useful for Hollywood types. It also can look reasonably like a Middle Eastern place as well. They also provided 150 extras, military men, to be in the background of shots. They helped produce hundreds of uniforms and provided opportunities to use very expensive aircraft. Of course, you're never going to be able to buy an F-35 plane if you're, a Hollywood company. That would just be way too expensive. So the only way you can get them is to rent them out or get them for free from the military. Now, the deal with the devil you sign when you do, partner with the DoD is that the military essentially has complete editorial control over the script. Every I must be dotted, every T must be crossed in exactly the way they like. And we can actually see that how the film actually changed with Department of Defense involvement. So the original Iron Man script was a decidedly pacifist narrative where the protagonist, Tony Stark, used his big manufacturing empire to actually go against the military-industrial complex and try to end the system of private profiteering from wars. But this basically was all taken out of the final film, probably at the Department of Defense's request. And so in the end, the military became, in the final version of Iron Man, the heroes of the thing. And the message was essentially that the United States military was great, which is a complete subversion of what the artist had in mind at the start, and really has robbed us of something that really could have been a useful tool in talking about serious issues.
Wow. Okay. What about the well-known film 12 Strong?
Yeah, sure. So 12 Strong, of course, is based on a true story about 12 US Special Forces who, right after September 11th happened, were sent to Afghanistan to, conduct surveillance missions and assassination campaigns. The film starts by talking about how the Western forces are outnumbered by 50,000 Taliban and Al-Qaeda troops. Of course, that's complete nonsense because the Taliban immediately condemned the September 11 attacks. And of course, even US sources quietly concede that the membership of Al-Qaeda at the time of 9/11 was under 100. So it was in the dozens, not even the hundreds, and certainly not the tens of thousands. Ultimately, the Department of Defense, even their own records say that 12 Strong asked for a, quote, breathtaking list of demands, which includes all sorts of military vehicles, army uniforms. They provided the production company with vehicles that they could blow up. They sourced Soviet-era tanks and helicopters for them. They allowed them to use Chinook and Seahawk helicopters. All of this, came at a price, though. And so all sorts of things got taken out of the movie. Even things that you might think were completely banal and, pointless and, not worth quibbling over. The DoD really makes sure that absolutely everything is the way they like it. So, for instance, they removed all tattoos from the soldiers. They insisted that the soldiers were clean cut and they didn't have beards like they did in real life, of course, because they were, going undercover. They weren't carrying razors or anything. They insisted they had crew cuts and looked good. And the company, didn't immediately get back to them on that, and they really pulled the rug from under their feet. They said, "We will pull this entire movie if you don't do this immediately." Not only that, it also removed the background of a lot of the real characters who were perhaps a little bit less savory. A lot of the people of this group of 12 were kind of from the bad side of town. A lot of them had been to jail. It was made clear that it was either prison or the military for a lot of these people, and the Department of Defense insisted that those got taken out, even though that they were completely true aspects of the story. And that's what really belies a lot of the propaganda about what the military says. They say they're involved in Hollywood only to make sure that films are as accurate as possible. But actually, what they're there for is to make sure films have as big a pro-war a message as possible, even if that means completely going against the truth.
Similar to Godzilla, where they basically rewrote the script to glorify the use of nuclear weapons. Now, what about the film The Lone Survivor of 2009?
Yeah, that's another Afghan war film where a group of US Navy SEALs were put in to do a special mission in rural Afghanistan. The film, again, is based on Marcus Luttrell's book. You might know Luttrell as this extreme far-right guy who's now a Trump-loving celebrity and has got his own show on Glenn Beck's network, The Blaze. In his book, it's page after page of him talking about what happened and how he, blames liberals for his group's defeat. He was literally the lone survivor of this special mission. Everyone else in the Navy SEAL team was killed by the Taliban. What happened was they were supposed to fly in, do a secret mission to kill a Taliban commander, and then get out of there really quickly. The film really revolves around what happened next, which was that they were immediately spotted by some local goat herders, 3 of them, and the group took them hostage and were debating what to do with them. Should they kill them or should they let them go? And they said, if they let them go, then they'll probably tell the Taliban where we are, and we're going to have, hundreds of troops, maybe thousands, on our ass immediately. And so in the end, they decide that they're going to let them go, and then that's exactly what happens. The troops come in, they're slaughtered, and Luttrell actually only survives because a local Afghan hid him in his barn. But in the book, it's much more shady, in fact, because the group was debating for a long time whether to kill these people, and they were saying that it was absolutely fine. We should do this war crime. I should mention that the 3 goat herders were 2 children and an extremely old man. Luttrell's book is basically a long apology for not committing this war crime. He says that it was the only time in his life that he'd made a stupid liberal decision, and the only reason he did it was because he thought that the liberal media at home would side with the Taliban, like they always do, and he would get executed at The Hague if he did this. So he just let them go, which is absolutely crazy to think that the American media would side over the Taliban with the troops. But okay, so yeah, this entire part of the book was completely cut from the movie. There was no talk about committing war crimes. It was just all about, we have to do the right thing and let these guys go. The entire premise, though, is completely stupid, because the fact of the matter is that everybody in that entire region knew that this special operation was going on, because the Navy SEALs arrived in a massive, loud Chinook, which flew over the valley where everybody lived, then did the drop. They didn't even bother cleaning up after themselves. So there was all these US ropes and uniforms and stuff around. So absolutely everybody knew that they were there anyway. It was one of the most incompetent adventures of the US war in Afghanistan anyway. But again, the Department of Defense cleaned this up, even though that the documents we've got show that they knew all of this was to be true. But they said that actually this is this is like showing the military in a very bad light. So we have to take everything out. They also took out things like swear words, all sorts of gender and race-based slurs that they were using. Even stuff like, farting on people was just taken out because they didn't want to portray the Navy SEALs as uncouth and stupid as they actually were in real life. And so ultimately it was turned into this pro-war glory film rather than what it was, which was one of the most embarrassing moments for the US military in the 21st century.
Wow, thank you so much, Alan, for joining us today and giving us real insights into these issues. We hope that you'll join us again here on the Watchdog. Thank you very much to the audience also for joining us today. We'll see you next time.